and and the United States Air Force Academy and the Defense Intelligence Agency. And I'll bet he's never had to compete with my dog Thor. Sorry about that. Bob has also addressed relief workers and caregivers around the world, helping them to psychologically debrief from traumatic experiences in nations that were rebuilding from years of terror and torture. Bob Wicks is the author of more than 50 books written for both professionals and the general public, including the best-selling Riding the Dragon, 10 Lessons for Inner Strength in Challenging Times. My favorite is The Resilient Clinician, but he's got a lot of good ones out there, and I strongly recommend you just go to Amazon and hit books by Robert Wicks if you want to get overwhelmed. Bob, we really feel honored and privileged that you're here, and take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. A number of months back, I was surprised in the sense that I began to recognize how difficult life was, not simply for people in my business as a clinical psychologist, but also in general. And one thing that inspired me was to be invited by Ethel Kennedy to attend the 50th memorial of the death of RFK. And at that memorial, when I went down for it, there were a lot of great speakers. Bill Clinton spoke and others spoke. But what really spoke to my heart were the words of RFK in particular. And the phrase that strikes me, that stuck with me, is we can do better. We can do better. Being a compassionate person impacts others. As the Chinese proverb goes, when the tide rises, the boats in the water do as well. Being compassionate also helps us. Physician and humanitarian Albert Schweitzer once said, "I don't know what your destiny will be, but one thing I do know. The only ones among you who will be truly happy are those who have sought and found how to serve." Yet while this is true, that doesn't mean that it's easy. Years ago, I guess it was maybe 35 years ago, I was up at Harvard sitting in the little apartment of Henry Nouwen, and we were chatting about a book that I wanted to write called Relationships, Nurturing the Gift of Availability. And he said, "You seem more practical than that." I said, "Well, I'd like to consider that I'm practical." He said, "Well, availability is not just a gift, it's a problem." And I changed the title of the book to Availability, the Problem and the Gift. And I began to realize what he was saying. And he said, "There must be something biblical about this." I said, "Well, what do you think?" I don't know. I don't know. And then halfway through our chat, he said, "I've got it." I said, "Well, what is it?" He said, "It's pruning. When we prune something, it doesn't blossom less, it blossoms more deeply." I think that we are in the midst at this point of a spiritual and psychological winter solstice. And in trying to be in this, we recognize we've been in the dark, we remain in the dark, but we can see the light. We can see the light. And I think that as we try to be a presence to our children, our spouse, our friends, where we work, maybe in some form of caring ministry, we need to recognize that it's very easy for us to lose our way in the process. I remember running into a woman who was a spiritual guide for many people, and I hadn't seen her in a long while. And I said to her, "Oh, it's so good to see you. How are you doing?" And she looked at me and got all filled up. And I said, what's going on? And she said to me, "No one has asked me that question in a long, long while." Given this frequent lack of support for persons like yourself who reach out to so many I've come to speak to you of compassion, enhancing personal resilience, improving self-care, and deepening your inner life through alone time. And in essence, I'm going to try to select a few points from 4 of my books: Night Call, Perspective, Bounce, and Prayerfulness, on the simple care of a hopeful heart. And the reason I mention these books in particular is a friend of mine said to me recently, he said, well, how many books have you published? And I told him, and he looked at me and he said, Bob, I think you need to get out more often. I didn't realize how much I had actually done. Well, anyway, my work over the past 35 years has involved 2 elements that I want to share with you. One is the prevention of secondary stress. And secondary stress represents the pressures that result in reaching out to others. And so I work, as was mentioned, with physicians and nurses, psychologists, psychiatrists, members of the military, police, people in ministry, and committed people like yourself. And the second area is resiliency, psychology, and spirituality, which is designed not simply to help people bounce back from stress, which is good, but actually paradoxically, because of it, to become deeper as persons, both psychologically and spiritually, in ways that would not have been possible had the stress not occurred in the first place. It's what we call in psychology post-traumatic growth, or in theology and religion, the spirituality of suffering. One of the things that happened during this COVID-19 is it magnified the kinds of challenges we face in attempting to be compassionate spiritual people. Recently, I recognized how easy it is to get caught off guard. I was asked to go to Dover Air Force Base to speak. And part of that reason is they know that I was also a former Marine Corps officer. And I got there, they wanted me to speak to the unit responsible for fallen military and their families when they fly the body in, and then the family comes and stays overnight in the house they have to receive their loved one. And I was in that house, and I heard about a little boy that was there that didn't realize his dad had died. He just didn't get it, even though they told him. And finally he got it. And he said, well, who's going to play ball with me now? And the volunteer there, luckily, was from the area and said, I will. Also, not being aware of serious stress in our life as we seek to reach out to others, which is the very call of a very religious faith group, can actually be quite dangerous. When I was in Germany working with military chaplains who had been in Iraq and Afghanistan, I was getting ready to give a talk on my book, Bounce, Living the Resilient Life. And this full bird colonel came up to me and he said, Dr. Wicks, before you give this talk, one caution. I said, what's the caution? He said, there's a lot of ghosts in this room. I said, well, what do you mean by that? He said, there's nothing left inside them. However, I'd like to broaden the topic this evening because the seeds of compassion and the seeds of burnout, which we know as chronic secondary stress, are the same seeds. So every one of us who cares needs to be concerned, not just professional helpers and healers. It's my belief that for every case of a spiritually committed, compassionate person experiencing significant stress, there are at least a dozen of us experiencing some form of spiritual and psychological burnout. Being torn apart by stress is very common today because of the difficulties going on in the world, pressures at work, troubles in our family, and even encountering darkness within ourselves. And also because of COVID-19, there's a necessity of dealing with change in ourselves and the world, and we can't turn our back on change. Openness to change is also part of unlearning, which is a cornerstone of the spiritual life. Author Kathleen Norris addressed the dynamics of change in this way. She said, disconnecting from change does not recapture the past. it loses the future. The problem is that most often dealing with change and the experience of stress is a developmental process, not a cataclysmic event. It can just sneak up on you. Author and media theorist Marshall McLuhan once said, if the temperature of the bath rises 1 degree every 10 minutes, how will the bather know when to scream? We don't know when to scream today. It's very easy for us to lose our way, even when we're seeking to live a good life as committed friends, parents, children, siblings, co-workers, or in any role where we're called to be compassionate. When I was in South Africa post-apartheid to address the people trying to take care of that country at that difficult juncture, I was giving a talk on a book I wrote at the time, Perspective, trying to get them to view things differently. And at the break, a woman came up to me and she said, well, I just can't do it anymore. I said, well, what is it that you do? She said, I'm a social worker and I'm assigned to get women who have been physically or sexually abused justice. And then they have to take a day off from work to go to the courts, and they're poor and often single parents, but they do it. And then we get to the court and the judge, who's often male, looks at the papers and says, oh, I haven't had a chance to read this yet. Make another appointment. She said, I'm a failure. Well, I just didn't say anything immediately because she was very upset. And then I asked her, well, who was with that woman other than you at that moment? She said, well, no one. I said, would it be an exaggeration to say that you were closer to her at that moment than anyone else in the world? She said, no, it wouldn't be. And then in as gentle a voice as I could muster, I asked, and you want to leave that? I said, don't you realize, as spiritually committed persons, we're not in the success business. We're in the faithfulness business. In addition, in our sometimes intense interaction with family, friends, co-workers, members of our parish, and those who come for us for guidance, we may not appreciate the reality and eventuality of failure. You see, statistically, the more you're involved, the more you're going to fail. So if you say this group is very caring, well, then you're going to have one of the highest failure rates. It's just statistical. When I work with surgical residents, I say, before we get into this whole, resilience stuff, I need to tell you something, that in your tenure as a surgeon, you are going to kill some people. Maybe not through malpractice, but through mispractice, because it is impossible to be at an A level 100% of the time. It's impossible. Whether you're the pastor, whether you are, a lay leader, whatever you are, whether you're a parent, a sibling, child of an adult parent, you're going to fail. But commitment is expected of us, so we better be able to put failure in perspective. A contemporary of Jesus, Rabbi Tarfon, once said, the day is short, the work is great, the laborers are sluggish, the wages are high, and the master of the house is insistent. It is not your duty to finish the work, but you are not free to neglect it, unquote. Alan Bisak of South Africa echoed this theme, and he said, we will all go before God to be judged, and God will ask us, where are your wounds? And if we're honest, we'll say, we have no wounds, Lord. And then God will ask, was there nothing worth fighting for? Now you may say, well, I don't have to worry about that. I have plenty of wounds to show the Lord. Well, I want to challenge both myself and you. Are they real wounds? Or are they ones tied to our ego or lack of faith? See? I remember once going into a room to speak to a group with terrible morale. And I'm not famous, so they didn't know me. But when I got into the room, they hated me. I mean, I was amazed that you could cut the hate with a knife. And I was clinically impressed. I thought, well, let me give it my best shot. And I did, and nothing. I mean, they were able to keep that hate at such a high pitch for so long. I said, how could they do that? And being a religious person, at the break, I went back to my room and I prayed prayers of somebody like myself with a big ego, like, relieve me of this. I even went into some Old Testament laments like, smite them and their little children. And I sensed Jesus say to me, I know where you got that, but we don't do that anymore. And then all of a sudden, what bubbled to the surface was a piece of scripture that I had read again and again and again, but didn't get. And the scripture was, they did terrible things to me and the prophets before me. They will do the same to you and worse at times. It was like the Lord was saying to me, Bob, normally you say religious things and people smile and they embrace you. But when things get difficult, you want to run away. In addition, I think that what we need to recognize is that in such instances, we have to lean back amidst our stress so we can be prayerful and mindful rather than react with our family, friends, coworkers, parishioners, or those we serve or guide in some way, because without being reflective or prayerful, we can lose our way very, very quickly. When I was lecturing at Walter Reed Army Hospital, at the break, a physician came up and he said, do you have a moment? I said, I do. He said, I'm blowing my whole life through my rear end. Can you help me? I said, well, can you be a little more specific? And he said, well, yes, I just returned from Iraq and I'm here at Walter Reed and I'm just cutting people's legs off. I'd like to take a damn gallbladder out for a change. And then he said, I know they're going to deploy me again. And I'm so nuts, and I get home and I go upstairs and try to hit a few golf balls to calm down. And my wife burst into the room and says, you're at work all day and you come back here, and instead of being with me and the boys, you're hitting golf balls. This marriage is disappearing. And slams the door. And I said, well, what do you do right after work? And he said, well, I go home. Now he's angry at me. And that happens all the time. And I said, well, you can't do that. He said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, when you go into a restaurant and you go to the bathroom, there's a sign over the sink that says that if you work here, you need to wash your hands after you go to the bathroom. We who work in the hospital need to wash our hands not only after we go to the bathroom, but before we go to the bathroom, so we don't contaminate ourselves and in turn contaminate others by what we've experienced on the floors in the hospital. I said, you're leaving the hospital spiritually and psychologically contaminated, and then you contaminate others, including your family. And he said to me, well, what do I do about it? Is it a big deal? I said, no, it's very simple. I said, after work, give yourself some time to just walk around the hospital. And if that doesn't work, because they'll yell, doc, doc, then get downstairs, walk on the grounds, or go and sit in your car or drive somewhere just for 5 or 10 minutes and let the dust settle. See, let the dust settle. Sit there recognizing, and you may even want to do a review. You want to do an objective review, say, do the geography of the day. What happened? Then a subjective review. Well, how did I feel about it? And then underneath those feelings, what were my cognitions? What were my ways of thinking, perceiving, and understanding that led to those feelings? And then when you get home, apologize to your wife and say to her, look, I've let you down. I need to be more mindful. And by that, I mean, I need to be present in the now and be open to not only you and the boys, but what God is telling me. It's Paul Tillich's ecstatic reasoning. Where is this connection of the immediate with the ultimate? And then tell her you're going to go upstairs. You're going to hit a few golf balls just to calm down further. But you're going to take that uniform, that role, and leave it. Take it off. Change your clothes. And leave that place behind. Now, what I'm saying to the physician is he needs to psychologically and spiritually lean back. Yet, as people committed to your faith and spirituality, that even if we're aware of the importance of reflection, prayer, and periods of mindfulness or meditation, there's no guarantee that we're going to remember to do it. All of us forget to give it priority. It's the old, I think, Stephen Covey thing. Don't just prioritize your schedule your priorities. You would say, oh, I don't have to worry about that. Please. When I was in Cambodia, I was giving a talk to them. They were trying to rebuild that country after all the terrible things. And at the break, a Buddhist nun came up to me and she said, do you have a moment? I said, yes, I do, sister. What can I do for you? And she said, we have a young Buddhist who is the chaplain in the unit in the hospital that takes care of farmers who've had their legs blown off by landmines, and they put the prosthetic devices on, but he's getting very depressed. And I said to her, well, sister, when he's done with the day and he comes down to his car and before he drives back to the temple and the Buddhist community there, when he meditates, what comes up in the meditation? It would help me give you feedback. And she looks at me like a deer caught in the headlights. And she says, oh, I am so embarrassed, doctor. I said, sister, what are you embarrassed about? She said, I'm a Buddhist nun. And I never thought about mentioning meditation to him. You see, meditation really does change things. There's a Zen saying, face reality and unwilled change will take place. That happens in meditation. People come to me and they want to maximize their resiliency range. A resiliency range basically is formed by genetics, DNA, early childhood experiences. That's not the issue, the range. It's how do you maximize within that range? And you need to have motivation and knowledge and hopefully wisdom. But at the heart of that process is gaining, regaining, and maintaining a healthy perspective. In psychiatry and psychology, we've emphasized that to the extent that we almost take credit for it. But religion, for generation upon generation, have emphasized a healthy perspective. In the Talmud, we read, you do not see things as they are, you see things as you are. In our own Christian New Testament, in Matthew 6:22, if your eye is good, your whole body will be good. Buddhists speak about it as the unobstructed vision. Hindus in the Upanishads are turning around in one seat of consciousness. It's at the heart of really dealing with life and with people and yourself, this healthy perspective. In a dialogue between a master and a disciple, an image was given. If you take the image with you this night, worth the whole trip. To a disciple who was forever complaining about others, the master said, seek not to change others, but seek to change yourself instead. And then he gave the image. He said, remember, it is easier to protect your feet by putting on slippers rather than trying to carpet the whole of the earth. But what happens to us? We leave the house and enter the carpeting business because we believe that people will appreciate what we do for them and they'd actually follow what we suggest. But the reality is that we need to give with the sense of mitzvah. What do I mean by that? Giving and expecting nothing in return. This is a 1 Corinthians 12, where we find our charism, our gift. We deepen that charism, and then we share it freely, expecting nothing in return. But we need these slippers. And what are those slippers? It's our psychology, our attitude, our perspective, our spirituality, our faith. But I mean faith in the deepest broadest sense of the term. There's a Sanskrit word for faith, viswas, and literally translated, it means to breathe easily, to have trust, to be free from fear. And this kind of perspective and resilience is not just about us. It's about all those that we come in contact with, because they, in a sense the space that we can offer them that is so powerful, see? So how do we begin? How do we begin to have this kind of resilience, this kind of perspective? I think it's very important to pay attention to the words of Jesus. And I'm going to share with you in a moment the basis of this presentation, because life is so fleeting. Author and physician Walker Percy wrote in one of his novels, "What if life is like a plane and you miss it?" Well, it's easy to do today if you're caring, busy people who are sometimes regretting the past and worried about the future. We're rarely in the present, where some of us believe God is, but we're either in the silver casket of nostalgia or preoccupied with the future. Author James Joyce said of one of his characters, "Mr. Duffy lived a short distance from his body." Well, isn't that the way we live much of the time? When you were thinking about tonight, you thought, it's going to be a whole hour he's going to speak. I hope the guy's not terrible. Well, you haven't even met me yet, but you're in the future. Or you're thinking about the past. Oh, this happened, that happened. But I think we can do something about it. And Jesus is the ideal teacher for this. And the passage that I'm going to base tonight on is Matthew 22, 34 to 40. And in that passage, Jesus is asked a classic rabbinical question. Rabbis are asked this all the time. What is the greatest commandment? And he, like a good rabbi, does two things. One, he puts people at ease. And once they're at ease, he pulls out the rug from under them. Because what he does is he reaches into Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And he selects first one of the heavy precepts of the 613 precepts of the Pharisees of the day. And he holds it up high and he says, you must love God with your whole heart and your whole mind and your whole soul. How are you going to disagree with that? But then he takes a light precept and holds it up on the same level as the heavy precept. And he says, and you must love your neighbor as yourself. And in doing this, he gives us the three pieces that we must balance for our whole life. And that's balance of presence to others, because I don't think it's possible to experience true joy if you can't share it. Presence to yourself, because self-care, self-knowledge, and self-love are essential. You can't share what you don't have. See? And finally, the most important presence to God. Presence to God, which is mysterious, dramatic, and challenging. Even in Scripture. Remember the Karl Barth's words. When we read Scripture and say, what is this book saying? It should say in return, who is it that's asking? Your identity is on the line. And so I'd like to quickly pack in some material from my books. And I say quickly because when Father John Ball invited me, I said, do you want me to be, informative? You want me to be inspirational? You want me to be humorous? He said, no, I want you to end on time. So I'm going to try to end on time. I'll be careful. All right, so let's look briefly at presence to others, because I want to focus on you tonight. But others is important because it's a circle of grace. Even when we fail with others, somehow, in some way, God is saying something to us. Now, I'm only going to give you two words with this presence to others. And the first is simplicity. I think people go, oh my gosh, this is too difficult for me. Well, the person maybe should be referred to people like me, but that doesn't mean you don't have a role in standing with them. Once a little girl was late coming home from school and her mother was furious. She said, where were you? I was so worried. Oh, she said, I was helping a friend who was in trouble. She said, well, what did you do for her? And she said, oh, I sat down next to her and helped her cry. Presence has a sense of simplicity. It also involves respect. That's the core of our presence to others. I had a patient who was sexually abused as a child, and I was seeing her as an adult. We were coming into the end of the treatment, and I wanted to make an intervention. I wanted to say something to her, but I didn't want to be a hypocrite, because in doing clinical supervision with psychiatrists, psychologists, and pastoral counselors and nurses and all these helpers, I'd say to them when they made an intervention, when they said something to a patient or a client or a parishioner, I said to them, I should be able to ask you, why did you say that? Why did you say that now? Why did you say that now in that way? And what did you expect? Don't tell me it was intuition. You can't calibrate for intuition. Good intuition comes out of good discipline as a compassionate helper. So I thought, well, okay, I don't want to be a hypocrite. So what do I want to accomplish in interrupting this person as we end the 3-year series of therapy? I said, I want to stop her, let her take credit for the hard work she's done, and then ask her how she got to this point so that when she enters darkness again, because darkness comes and goes for us all, she'll know what to do. That was my brainstorm. So I said, picture my face as a mirror. What do you see? Oh, she said, I see a woman alive with the Spirit, a woman who's resurrected that little girl that was lost and integrated her with the woman she is now. And because of it, she's hot stuff. And I said, yes, you are hot stuff. But how did you get to this place? You weren't this way when you came in to see me. And she said, it was simple. I said, simple? She said, yeah. The first time I came in here to see you, I simply watched how you sat with me. And then I began sitting with myself in the same way. A respectful presence is simple and powerful, but it's not easy. Archbishop Desmond Tutu was speaking at General Theological Seminary in New York to the Anglican and Episcopalian seminarians. And halfway through his presentation, one of the seminarians out in the audience who was sitting next to the dean nudged the dean and pointed up and said, Desmond Tutu was a holy man. The dean looked at him and said, how do you know he's holy? The young man didn't even blink. He said, I know that Desmond Tutu is holy because when I'm with Desmond Tutu, I feel holy. The question I challenge you with this evening is, how do people feel when they're with you? Do they feel a space where they can rest their doubts, their concerns, their energy about new ways of doing whatever you do in this group? Or do they feel your need to be right, your need to control, your need to be seen as special? What do they experience? It's scriptural. What's the fruits? You've been with people who say one thing, and I was over breakfast with a self-proclaimed peace activist. My God, was he intense. It was total agita for breakfast. He would say Pastor Sugar was like incoming nuclear war. And at the end of the breakfast, he went to get a cup of coffee, and there was this little Irish priest there. He put down his spoon, looked at me through his big brown eyes. I said, Sean, what? He said, glory be to God, Robert. I said, what? He said, every time that boy speaks about peace, he scares the hell out of me. Carl Buna put it this way: they may forget what you said, but they will never forget how you made them feel. See, this comment reminded me of a different story of how horribly the inmates at a concentration camp were treated during World War II. However, when they returned after a day of dehumanization and impossible work, a stray dog that had gotten into the camp became so excited to see them and wagged his tail vigorously so that the dog, rather than the quote unquote human beings running the camp, reflected for the prisoners that they were worth a great deal as persons. What are you reflecting in your presence to others? Well, this relies on really how we prepare to be such a presence to others and become more at home with ourselves and God. I think we need 3 simple but profound steps. First, know the dangers of being a compassionate person. It's dangerous. See? When you're close to something, you run the risk of being contaminated yourself. It's what we call in my business parallel process. When I was in Lebanon and Beirut working with helpers and healers from Aleppo, Syria, and that they brought over there so I could work with them on resilience through an Arabic interpreter, you could sense what was sitting there was, the sense of, well, I'm helpless now because I tried to help all these people and I failed. Now, what are you going to do? See? And I had to lean back and say to them, I've been in Cambodia, I've been in Haiti, I've been a lot of places. But I'll never know your situation because it's unique. But whatever you can take from me, take, because you deserve it. The second is take care of yourself and know yourself more fully each day, which is especially important for us as adults because we think we do know ourselves fully. However, at each stage of life, new blind areas arise as a matter of course and need to be uncovered and faced. And even systemically, your organization is going to go through phases and you're going to think you know what you're doing and you don't really. Why? Because the people around you don't feel empowered. It's just a phase. And then finally, have your own practice of alone time. And by alone time, I mean essentially time in silence and solitude and wrapped in gratitude before God, or even amongst the group, being in a reflective stance. So let's look at a few of the dangers. One of the dangers is over-involvement. Even with those we love, we need to know enough to lean back into the now so we can have a healthy distance from the emotions you're going to face. I'm not asking you to be callous. I don't want you, don't want you to get overwhelmed by the emotions, needs, and unrealistic expectations of those you love and care for. You see, the opposite of detachment is not compassion, it's seduction. We are pulled in by people's expectations and emotions rather than simply saying, what can I do? And then let others and God take care of the residue. There's a Russian proverb that goes, when you sleep next to the cemetery, you can't cry for everyone who dies. Detachment is part of a triad. We lean back, we reappraise, and we renew. Another danger is anger, hurt, and fragility among members of your family, friends, and coworkers. Every family, every system has people angry and bitter. I was asked once to monitor to mentor a person who just was, so sarcastic and negative. So she shocked me one day. She came in and said, I read your book, Riding the Dragon, and I really loved it. I said, well, thank you. And in the next breath, she said, too bad you're not like what you've written. Well, after I prayed for her early, happy death, I thought to myself, I said, well, from the tone in your voice and what you've said, it's obvious you feel I've let you down in some way. Maybe we can talk about it. You see, what I did was the pastoral double reflection. First reflected within myself rather than immediately react, which is she was used to from people because she was so tough. And then to reflect with the person once you've calmed down through reflection within yourself. Another danger is experiencing stress over a long period of time. See, and it's not going to get any better. I have a colleague who's convinced that there are really only 3 annoying parishioners in the whole of America, and they just travel from parish to parish, You're always going to have people like this. I was coming home from work one day and my wife said, how are you doing? And I said, horrible. And she said, did something happen today at work? I said, no. And then I thought about it and I realized over the weeks and months, I had absorbed people's angers, their doubt, their resistance, their fears, their sense of hopelessness and helplessness. So what do you do about that? Well, the advice I would offer you, I didn't receive from another mental health professional, but from reading Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton, the contemplative and Trappist monk, was walking past a day room and he saw an old monk, 50 years a monk, looking down, and he went in and he said, "Brother, are you okay?" He looked up and he said, "Father Lewis, I'm not okay. I'm losing my joy, my peace, maybe my faith." Well, if you come to a shrink and somebody says that you're 50 years of, a monk, what do you say to them? You know what Merton did? He smiled at the old gent and he put his hand on his shoulder and he looked him in the eyes and he said, "Brother, courage comes and goes. Hold on for the next supply." We need patience, we need perseverance, and we need courage. And I mean, I can go on, but let me just give you one more danger. And you're going to be surprised, I think, by it. It's a failure to be grateful for all that is in our lives. You see, a failure to be grateful is very natural if we are involved in life deeply, because we're primarily focused on what needs to be done, as well as the problems and challenges in the family, country, and at work. But life is so much more than that. Vietnamese Zen Rashi Thich Nhat Hanh once reflected, during the Vietnam War, we were so busy helping the wounded that sometimes we forgot to smell the flowers. He said, night has a very pleasant smell here, especially in the country, but we would forget to pay attention to the smell of mint, coriander, thyme, and sage. I was in Hanoi about 5 years ago, working with helpers and healers, and I was in this canoe riding up the river toward the perfumed pagoda, and I could smell those scents, And I thought of the fact that we often are guilty of gratefulness tolerance. Brother David Stendhal Rast once said, the problem with us is we leave the house, and on that house is a mental list of what we'll be grateful for. He said, throw away the list and be grateful for whatever you encounter. So what do we need to stay afloat given these dangers? Well, I think self-care and prayerfulness will give us the healthy perspective we need. Given this, the good news is it's not the amount of darkness in the world that matters. It's not the amount of darkness in your parish, your family, or even in yourself that matters. It's how you stand in that darkness that ultimately is crucial. So we need these other two presences, the presence to ourselves through self-care. And people like me and people like you who care or say we care, we're the worst with respect to self-care. It's as if we metaphorically eat whatever happens to be in front of us psychologically or spiritually. I think that humorist was right a number of years ago when she said, Irma Bombeck, I don't know if you remember her. She said she thought that any man that watched 3 football games in a row should be declared legally dead. What is she pointing to? She's pointing to the fact that we just take whatever's there. And in the Bounce book I wrote, there's a whole thing on a self-care protocol. Your library might have a copy, and just go in and Xerox that section on self-care. But take a look at it. It's important that, if you really believe in Imago Dei, you're made in the image and likeness of God, well, for heaven's sakes, you've been given the gift of birth and development. Why are you not enjoying that? That's an affront to God. And in that self-care protocol, 2 of the things that are essential is one is friendship and the other is prayer. Let me say a few words about them, wrap it up, and then we'll open to some questions. Friendship is very, very important. There's a Cameroonian proverb that goes, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. I'm realistic, though. When I came back from working in India, I brought a saying back that says, when once you've been bitten by a snake, you become cautious even of a rope. You've been hurt by family members, friends, people in the parish, maybe people in this group that you belong to. That happens. But there's also another saying that goes, a friend knows the song in your heart and can sing it back to you when you've forgotten how it goes. I would suggest 4 types of friends. One is the prophet. Nobody likes the prophet. Henry Thoreau once said, if you see someone coming to do good for you, run for your life. But the prophet asks the question, what voices are guiding you in life? You know, there's a saying in psychology that goes, if you think you're free, you're lost. We are so controlled by memories that we've repressed, and the only memory that's going to hurt you is one that's forgotten because it operates sub rosa. The prophet starts to challenge us, challenges you as an individual and this group as a system to constantly grow and be dynamic. See? And then the second friend is the cheerleader. The cheerleader, if you only have prophets, you'll burn out. If you only have cheerleaders, you won't grow. But together, when I make an intervention with a patient or somebody comes in for mentoring, if I just give clarity, then I cause narcissistic injury. I hurt them. If I just give kindness, they don't grow. But it's this balance between the two that's crucial. See, the cheerleader can help us see the loving face of God. So in the process, we can see our own goodness. The prophet is there to wake us up. The third type of friend is the harasser or teaser, because on the way to taking yourself, way to taking your ministry seriously and your life seriously, it's very easy to take a detour and take yourself too seriously. You can see that in politics. You can even see it in religion, unfortunately, today. And you need to recognize these humorous persons are key. I often look to mothers of presidents. I still remember Lillian Carter. I don't know if you remember her, Jimmy Carter's mom. She was asked once, she said, "You ever have any tough periods?" "Oh," she said, "yeah." She said, "Sometimes when I look around at my children, I think, oh, I should have remained a virgin." The other one is Barbara Bush. She was the greatest. She was sitting there in the hospital for the last time. She died shortly thereafter with her nurse. George Bush, her son, came in. And she pointed up at George and said to the nurse, "Do you know why he is the way he is?" And the nurse was surprised. She said, "No. When I was pregnant with him, I drank and smoked." The reality is you have to have a sense of humor. And the final friend is the inspirational friend. And this is the person who calls you to be all that you can be without embarrassing you that you are where you are. And these kinds of friends help us with the 3 calls in life that are psychological and spiritual. The first call is self-understanding, knowing your name before God. It's easy to let other people give you a name and you're stuck with it psychologically and spiritually, unless you wake up. I mean, it might be a name that you're comfortable with. Abraham was very comfortable, but he was called to be Abraham, the father of his people. Sarai finally was getting used to not having a child, and she was getting older. But she responded to the call to be Sarah, a woman filled with new potential. And the second calling is the pruning or surrender. So for me, I'm a passionate person. At some point in life, all of a sudden, I realized the passion was no longer a gift. It was harming people. I was intrusive. So I needed to be gentle, a gentle, passionate life. And then final calling is to make that pruning element your central element. So for me, it's a calling to be, gentle, first and foremost. But it's a leap into the darkness. You might say, what do you mean it's a leap into the darkness? Well, quite simply, every time I try to be gentle, and I focus on it, I realize all the times I haven't been. And then when I try, I fail. And you might say, well, then why would you continue doing it if it's a darkness? Because in the darkness, I experience 2 things. One is success is not the calling, faithfulness is. Also, I discover grace, what it really is. I can't do this by myself. My big ego is not going to do it. I need to walk with others, walk with God. That's the only way it's going to happen. And the old saying that when you die and you go to heaven and you're asked, well, where are the others? The whole sense of community and closeness to God, which brings me to my final point, and that's alone time and a regiment of prayer, what they called in the 4th and 5th centuries, the Abbas and Ammas of the desert called it a rule of prayer. And it includes, ritual and liturgy where you meet God in the Eucharist and in each other and in the Word. Faith sharing, like we're doing now. Formal prayer, reflections during the day, because I often stop and take a breath. Remember that today might be my last. Why? Because someone once said that life is something that happens while we're busy doing something else. You need to be mindful. And then spiritual reading and scripture. And as I said, the thing with scripture is an identity-based thing. A young man came to a rabbi, and said, I want to be a rabbi. And he said, well, go through Torah. And he came back in weeks rather than months or years. And he said, well, Rebbe, I've been through Torah 4 times. And the Rebbe said, yes, son, but how many times has Torah been through you? And then there's contemplation. And I'm a big pusher for alone time. Anne Lamott once said, almost anything will work again if you unplug it for a few minutes, including you. But she also said, you have to do it the right way. She said, my mind is like a bad neighborhood. I don't like to go there alone. Yeah. It's necessary. When I was up on Capitol Hill, one of the senators was asked, what is the greatest challenge facing the American Congress today? He shocked people. He said, not enough time to think. I would say not enough time to pray. And we need to do it in the right spirit and avoid the 3 dead ends. Arrogance, where we project the blame on others. Ignorance, where we condemn ourselves. That doesn't do anything. Behavior that you wince at will turn into behavior that you wink at. You can't keep doing that. And the third is discouragement. So what are we called to do? What am I selling? A spirit of intrigue in prayer. Well, let me close with a few brief comments. First, during the 10th session of psychotherapy and spiritual mentoring with others, usually what happens is all the dirt's on the table, the angers, the fears, the feelings of being misunderstood, it's all there. And as I look in their eyes, I've overcome with a deep sense of sadness because I think if only you could see how good you are, how gentle, what a difference you've made in so many people's lives. And I would say that to you. And I hope that during that contact, they regain that healthy perspective and see themselves through the loving eyes of God again. And that's my hope for you. If you haven't been in darkness recently and you're not in darkness now, you will be at some point because darkness comes and goes for everyone who cares. You may use good psychology, and you should. It's like a plow for the field, but the darkness may not lift as fast as you'd like. You may get on your knees and pray. The darkness still doesn't lift as fast as you'd like. Well, I promise you no less darkness and no quicker lifting in a faithful life. But I promise you this, that if you sit in that darkness, in a faithfulness to others, I'm going to still be compassionate with others. You sit in that darkness with a greater sense of yourself and self-care and self-understanding and self-love, and sit in that darkness waiting to see God in different ways. You will be different. You'll be deeper. You might say, well, why? Because when you sit in that darkness, what happens is you experience humility. And when you take knowledge and you add humility, you get wisdom. And when you take that very wisdom and add it to compassion, you get love. And love is at the heart of life. God is love. You see, life is chronic, but suffering need not be the last word. My daughter we only have one child. My daughter had severe scoliosis, and 13 levels of her spine fused. And in university, she said to me over breakfast, she said, "Dad, I never told you this, but I wanted to be a Marine Corps officer like you were." I said, you did? And she laughed because she got the result she wanted in saying that. She said, "But I can't because of my physical thing." I said, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" She said, "I'm going to become a social worker and I'm going to work in the VA." And she followed through and works now in Wisconsin with severely injured returning Iraqi and Afghani vets. But she's taken her own pain in this darkness and allowed God to transform it into something healing, not just for herself. Again, one of the greatest gifts we can give to others is a sense of our own peace and perspective, but we can't give what we don't have. And because of it, she can do things I can't do. I haven't been through it. I haven't had it transformed. Recently, a vet came in who had his leg blown off and she greeted him with warmth. And he said, "Boy, you're perky." And she looked him in the eye and she said, "You've served our country well. Now you come on in and let us know what we can do for you." President John F. Kennedy said, "One person can make a difference and every person should try." You may say, "Well, I have doubt. I am uncertain." Thomas Merton once said, "With deep faith comes deep doubt. So give up the business of suppressing doubt." And with respect to uncertainty, I would only add that uncertainty is a journey. It's the journey. Given this, let me close with a little prayer from a little book I did called Heartstorming. It's entitled, "Find Me Again, Lord." And we're open for some questions. "In the past, there are so many times you have found me, Lord, that I can't even recall all of them anymore. One moment I'd find myself feeling all alone, and the next you would be at my side. But now I need you to find me again, Lord. Let me know you are there in the splash of a goose landing in the water, the noise of a city at night, or in the quiet of a still forest. I need you to find me again, Lord. Help me to know you are thinking of me in the way someone offers a smile, and the care expressed in a note sent to me was simply a cup of coffee slowly enjoyed. I need you to find me again, Lord. Possibly the tears quietly sitting on my cheek will remind you once again of me. Maybe the giggles of a small child or broad grin of an old friend will have me recall your presence once more. But whatever it might be, I need you to find me again, Lord. So I hope you will whisper my name in some way so I can feel your intimate presence in my life. Yes, I need you to find me again, Lord. Soon. Amen. Well, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. I invite brothers, and if there are any sisters here, to turn on your cameras now. And Bill, I'm going to ask you to ask Bob a question, then I've got one, and then if you, while you're thinking about it, gentlemen and ladies, whoever's here, if you'd like to put a question in the chat, then please do, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can.
I'd just like to honor God and Bob and what he just said. Let's just take some time in silence. Whenever you come out of a time of silence, do it gently. Ask God to feather God's peace into the rest of your day, like a painter feathers one color into another with his brush. And Bob, I'd just like to ask you, you had said, know yourself more fully each day. What are some ways of doing that?
Well, the first is have a sense of openness. And that's very difficult, because at the heart of openness is a virtue that we don't see much today, and you don't see it in entertainment, sports, politics, even in religion. You might say, well, what's the virtue? Well, let me give you a story, because even if you want it, doesn't mean you're going to get it. My daughter said to the two girls she has, my two granddaughters, when they were about 6 and 8, what gifts do you have? They were sitting at the table after dinner. What gifts did God give you that you're going to share with the world? And they loved those exercises. So they went on and on and on. And after they settled down, my son-in-law had not said anything. And he said, well, what about humility? And they said, the youngest one said, well, what exactly is it? And he said, well, get the dictionary. So she got the dictionary and he read the definition. He said, now, who do you think of when I read this definition? And my two granddaughters and my daughter chimed up, Mom, referring to my wife. And he said, well, what about Pop-Pop? And they went, no, not Pop-Pop. The reality is, even if we want this virtue, but I think the question first for us is to pick up our feelings and then just don't leave them there. Instead, at some point say, well, what in my thinking, in my perceiving, in my understanding led to these feelings? And they can be positive even. So that we, in a sense, don't stop. People stop too soon. When I was, learning to be a therapist at Hahnemann Medical College, I still remember the training analyst saying, you're stopping too soon. And so the idea of questioning ourselves, taking a period during the day when we can reflect, really can help us deepen. And it's a constant spiritual journey at each stage of our lives. And I think that if we do that with the right spirit, a spirit of intrigue, you can gain all kinds of information about yourself. And that's wonderful.
Thank you, Bob.
So Bob, I have a question for you. Illuman, the group that most of us belong to, as an organization is going through what we're calling a reweaving process. And it involves examination by all the various groups within Illuman. And while some of the key leaders have confidence in the process, some don't, and some have no clue as to what's going on. So I would best describe it as a time of liminality, which is also compounded or complicated by the trauma of the pandemic and all the uncertainties related to it. And I know you've spoken some about this already in your presentation, but if there's something that you could maybe hold up again or re-emphasize, what would you recommend that really would help us to cope during this liminal time?
Well, Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, once said, the brighter the light, the deeper the darkness. Excuse me. So some of the people who have been most passionate in building the organization, that's their gift. They've really gotten involved. It's gotten them involved. It's a circle of grace. That's their gift. But every gift has a growing edge. And the growing edge often is that we begin to start to worship and believe in a structure or what we've created, which has been wonderful. But when you're at that turning point, the question is, do you want to make this wonder into a statue? Or do you want to make it into something living and full of life? And that requires a letting go. And that letting go is it sounds so lovely, doesn't it? But there's a mourning in it. So the very leaders who, they're not saying to new leaders, let's say, or new processes, don't be involved, because they're caring, loving people. I mean, that's not, they wouldn't do that. But unconsciously, I think they're not recognizing that uncertainty happens in transition. And it is in that uncertainty that new ideas, new hopes, and new leaders can take their place. I remember when I was teaching, and moving along in this program, and all of a sudden, I found myself sort of, really blocking things. I don't like their philosophy. I don't like, going on and on. And all of a sudden I said to myself, who made you God? You need to get out of their way. You need to contribute in a different way. And I thought, well, I don't even know how. Well, that's a good sign. Because if you knew how, then you'd screw it up. It's like one of the chesty puller from the Marine Corps. They asked him what esprit de corps was, and he says, well, I don't know, and I hope I never find out, and I hope nobody else does, because they'll screw it up. So if you really say you're involved in the spirit, then you need to make that transition, and it's not easy. Some people can't make it, and they can't make it. I mean, it's not that they're bad people, they just can't make it. Other people's, it's very difficult for them to have faith in the next phase. Or unconsciously, people don't do this consciously, they want to make it look like change, but it's not change. They want to make it look like collaborate. I wanted a new program, but I knew that you had to collaborate. So I went through all these collaboration deals. And then I went on sabbatical, and the chair who took over for me during sabbatical came and he said to me, oh, your program passed. And in his words, I thought, son of a gun. And at first I had to laugh because I got caught, But then I thought, that's exactly what you were doing. You would make letting go as you move forward. I wouldn't just say, this is a block and we're, how do we get around? No. This is grist for spiritual growth, not only individually, but systemically. How do we bring letting go? How do we bring, Jesus was saying, how do I bring in the good news? And people didn't like it because it was, good, but it was also new. So it's a great phase to be in, because it means that people have cared and invested a lot of energy. And I love those sages and grandfathers of a program like yours, but it's now time to pass it on to the dads, the new dads.
Thank you, Bob. Anthony Monticchio asks, he said, thanks, Bob, for sharing your heart and all the wisdom that life has granted you. Then his little smiley face. He says, with Father's Day coming up on Sunday, can you share with us the relationship that you had with your dad and the impact that's had on your life?
Mm-hmm. I wrote a piece recently, My Father Never Took a Walk with Me. And he was too busy. And he didn't know how to walk with me. And lovely guy, lovely fella, hardworking, funny. Oh. And you might think to yourself, well, boy, that really stunk, But what happened is the need opened up my eyes to the presence of fathers all around me. It made me, in a sense, become more aware of the relationship between Jesus and his Father. It really helped me appreciate fatherhood and seek it in ways that were empowering. So that, if you said to me, wouldn't you rather have had a dad who would take a walk with you? Oh yeah, sure. I won't deny that. But as in everything, you come to a crossroads, just like my daughter did with her scoliosis. And you take a route toward bitterness and absence, or towards new presence and possibility.
Thank you. Let's see, Rob O'Keefe, could you expand a bit on the balance between clarity and kindness?
Yeah, that's very important because it involves a lot. Like I remember supervising this really bright psychologist. Gosh, he was bright. And I said to him in clinical supervision, I said, well, why did you say that? And he said it was the right thing to say. I said, well, let me expand the question. Why did you say that? Why did you say that now? Why did you say that now in that way? And what did you expect? So that how we ask something of ourselves and when we ask it is very, very important. So clarity comes from finding a number of illustrations. You know, a friend of mine used to say, you know, if somebody calls you a jackass, you know, you're to be insulted. If two call you a jackass, you know, you ought to think about it. If three call you a jackass, buy yourself a saddle. And so I really resist knowledge about myself, you know. I just do. And I never, you know, I don't admit that. I mean, I say to people, oh, I'm sure I'm interested. But it's crap, you know. But I do know my emotions, so I can sense those emotions. And then I have something. It's a gift from God, you know. And anytime I get sensitive and, you know, I think of God's, you know, in John 15, you are my friend, right? You know, John 14, you know, twice Jesus says, you know, don't take heart, you know. I won't leave you orphaned. I'll come back for you. I mean, there's that connection. And that's why I also suggest to people they adopt a gospel. So I have a terrible memory, and yet each night I can walk through John's gospel with a theme or two from each one. And I'm sure your themes would be different, and then when I wake up or when I am at morning liturgy, you know, during the week, I can do that. And so I think all of those kinds of things help you come alive and really begin to see life very differently. It's different. It's very different, you know. And people keep, you know, they even trick themselves. The new normal. New normal. There's gonna be a new normal. Give me a break. But people need to hear that because it frames it in a way that they could swallow it. But your group, you don't, if you want more passion, then you're going to have more challenge. And you're going to have to accept more failure and more self-awareness about yourself. And that's why I mentioned those three phases. The first phase takes up most of our life. It's self-understanding, finding your name, your word, if you will. And I use passion for myself. Then recognizing when it needs to be pruned and balanced, you know. And then finally, the third phase, the leap into the darkness, you know, or as the mentor, as I said to the disciple who's ready for that third thing, he said to him, how are you growing spiritually? He said, oh, by little steps. You can't cross a chasm by taking little steps. You need to leap into the darkness. And that leap is to find one of those, in my language, one of those smaller signature strengths and bring it to the surface. You know, there's so much more to you, you know. And like, I mean, John, you might say to me, you know, people have been very gracious to me and they said this and this and this and this and this. And I'd say, yeah, that's the center of your ministry. That is just a wonder of the way you've taken autonomy, your will, and theonomy, God's will, and you brought them together and you feel the freedom. But what are the gifts that you have that you haven't given enough air?
That's a good question. I'll think about that a lot. Brandon K. wrote, how do you practice gratitude in your day-to-day life? I share 3 things I'm grateful for with friends quite often in an ongoing group text, but I feel like I always say the same or similar things. Do you have a suggestion for how I can expand upon my daily practice of gratitude?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And what I have found helpful is paying attention and not assuming. Now, for those of us who've traveled in certain areas, uh, yeah, I still remember, I think it was in Cambodia in the jungle. I remember a cold beverage. I thought, oh my gosh, this is terrific. But you take it for granted. We tend to, what we do is once we get gratefulness tolerance, as I spoke about, and and it's like a story that was told about the boatman who kept ferrying people over to a holy site. Excuse me. And one of the people in the boat, there were just two of them at that point. He said, "Have you been there?" "Oh no, I haven't." "Oh, really?" He said, "But that's okay. I have not finished enjoying this river." So I used to do, this is a little psychotic and I should have increased the meds 5 milligrams, but I used to, when I had my first house, I would go across the street and look at it. And I remember the neighbor coming over, said, what are you doing? I said, "Look at this house. Is this a kick in the pants?" And I started describing a number of things. And he said, "You're sick, Bob. You're sick. Don't you understand?" But what I did is I took things afresh. And I'll do that here in this little townhouse that I have. I'll do it, I'll catch myself, slugging a coffee down and say, "What did and it's seen as practical. Well, you got to do this. You're rushing to your grave. That's practical. So by in a sense, bringing your circle back and beginning to look at everything and saying, where's the gift here that I'm missing? You start to really find that most is gift if you look at it a little differently. You eat a little slower. You pay attention to what you're doing. You lean back from an activity that you love. Well, I do it when I'm writing. I'll stop and think, this is cool. That's the kind of thing. Deep gratefulness really is a revisiting. And it takes some energy and you feel corny at times, but don't worry about it. People don't get up in the morning thinking of you. So
Thank you for that. We've got about 9 minutes left. So if we have some other questions, we would love to entertain them. Okay. Turn on your cameras if you haven't already done that. And as we get ready to close out, if you have a word that you'd like to share, we'll do it sort of popcorn style. And I will invite you to jump in and just a word of something that you're taking away tonight. And then while you're doing that, I will end with a prayer. So just everybody can unmute yourself and just jump in when you can.
Kindness.
Peace. Gratitude.
Pruning.
Be present.
Make your pruning element your central element.
gratitude,
Lean back and pause.
Fulfillment of joy is God.
I don't know.
so let's take a minute and then pray together. And there's a wonderful little book. It's not written by Bob Wicks, but it's one he might know. It's called Finding God at Home, Family Life as a Spiritual Discipline. It's written by Ernest Boyer Jr. Do you know that book, Bob?
Yeah.
It's a wonderful little book. It's old. But he starts off each chapter with a prayer, and there's one that's, since I discovered this book about 30 years ago or more, actually, when it was first published under a title, a different title called Away in the World, I think it was called. He starts each chapter with a prayer, and
Amen.
the very first one is this: Dear God, kindle a fire in me. Kindle it and let it burn to a white heat. Kindle a fire and let it rage inside me to feed itself on my bone and blood and sinew until I am consumed and only the fire remains. Turn my soul into a blaze, God, a blaze so bright and hot that it can be felt right through me to warm with your warmth all who come near. Lord, I ask your blessing on each and every person gathered here tonight. I give thanks for our brother Bob and his wisdom and his willingness to share it. I give thanks for each of you who are here and to hear what Bob has to share. And I ask your continued blessings upon all of us. And we pray all these things in all the names of God that we know.